They said he was chosen, anointed, a voice for the righteous. But Elijah Hayes had mastered the art of silence. Every Sunday, he stood behind the oak pulpit of the oldest Baptist church in Marietta, Georgia, his voice calm, his presence composed, his words laced with grace and certainty. For 8 years, his sermons filled the pews. His name echoed in whispered prayers and church bulletins. He became the symbol of moral strength, a pillar that even storms of gossip could not shake. And yet, behind his sermons, behind the pressed black robes and gentle smile, Elijah lived as a man split in two. The Elijah they saw was celibate, steadfast, untouchable. But the Elijah they never knew had once loved a man named Micah Brooks. They met in college, young and unsure. That love, like wildfire, was too bright for the shadows they lived under. Elijah ended it, terrified of losing everything: the pulpit, the respect, the sanctuary he had been told was only meant for men like him if they played by rules written in shame. Martha Caldwell, one of the church's oldest and most powerful congregants, had always called Elijah her greatest joy. She had watched him grow from a seminary student into the figurehead of the congregation. She organized every fundraiser, scrutinized every guest list, and made sure Elijah's path remained clean, untouched by controversy. She also made sure he was never alone for too long. Sunday dinners with church families, nice daughters brought to choir practice, gentle nudges about companionship. But Elijah, always polite, always evasive, returned to his small home on the edge of church property alone, a house quiet enough to echo his secrets. He would cook a single meal, read, pray, walk the edges of the cemetery behind the chapel as if asking the stones to remind him why he stayed. To the congregation, his solitude was a mark of holiness. To Elijah, it was the consequence of survival. But secrets have weight, and the longer they are carried, the more they bend the spine and burden the breath. On Saturday evenings, he would press his hands together and pray not for salvation, but for strength. Not to be healed, but to endure. Not to be changed, but to remain unseen. The next morning, he would step back behind the pulpit, smile at the sea of familiar faces, and preach about truth, with a tongue that had learned how to hide it. He didn't expect change. He had made peace with the mask, until one Sunday morning, when the man he once loved walked through the chapel doors. The wooden floors didn't creak. No gasp stirred the room. Only Elijah noticed the man in the third pew head, slightly bowed, hands folded, eyes full of memory. Micah Brooks had returned, not as a storm, not as a reckoning, but as something far more dangerous to a man like Elijah, a mirror. And for the first time in years, Elijah's voice faltered. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for Elijah to feel the tremble beneath his ribs. He finished his sermon, shook hands at the exit, smiled through the tightness in his throat. But when the doors finally closed behind the last parishioner, he stood alone in the sanctuary and whispered a name he thought he'd buried long ago. Micah. The silence that answered wasn't empty. It was full of questions. And somewhere deep within, Elijah knew that whatever peace he had found in hiding was about to unravel. If this story touched something inside you, stay with us. Because what happens next will not only shake the church, but expose the cost of hiding love in the name of faith. Subscribe to Heart Story for next part. Micah Brooks had always known how to enter a room without needing to announce his presence. But that Sunday, it wasn't quiet confidence that brought him back to Marietta. It was something heavier, something quieter than grief and more urgent than nostalgia. He had flown from New York just days earlier. When asked, he told the few who still knew his name that he had returned to visit his mother, who had fallen ill. But Micah left out the details. He always had a reason to leave things out. He stepped into the church as the bell rang out its first chime. The air smelled like old wood and hymnals. He took a seat in the third pew, close enough to see Elijah's face, far enough not to be noticed, he hoped. But Elijah noticed. From the first moment he looked up, reading from the book of Romans, his breath caught in his chest. His voice held steady, but his eyes betrayed him. Micah sat still, his gaze fixed, his posture soft but resolute. He did not flinch under Elijah's glances. He did not frown. He only watched, as if to say, I see you, Basoing. Do you still see me? When the final song faded and the last parishioner offered their amen, Micah lingered in his seat. He waited for the crowd to thin, the hallway to quiet, the doors to close. And then, as if moved by something not yet spoken, he stood. Elijah had already turned toward the private study behind the pulpit. He didn't expect Micah to follow, but he did. In the narrow room lined with old theological texts and yellowing sermon notes, Elijah stood with his back to the door. When he turned, Micah was already there, framed in the doorway like a question long avoided. Their eyes met. No handshakes, no embrace, no accusations, just the silence of years, compressed into seconds. Micah looked at the man he once loved, not as a stranger, not as a preacher, but as the Elijah he had once kissed beneath a dormitory window, trembling with fear and wonder. That boy was still somewhere inside the man in front of him. And then, with the gentleness of a truth no longer needing to shout, Micah said only this, I've lived my truth. What about you? He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need to. He left the room the way he came, without ceremony, without noise, leaving behind only that question echoing off the walls like an unfinished hymn. What neither of them knew was that someone else had seen. Lucas sat in the hallway outside the study, pretending to organize pamphlets. At 18, he was the youngest member of the church's ministry group. He admired Elijah, his calm, his conviction, his unwavering devotion. But Lucas also carried a secret of his own, tucked between Bible pages and Sunday smiles. He had known for years that he was different, but seeing Elijah, his idol, his guide, speak to a man with such quiet intensity, Lucas felt something shift. Not judgment, not betrayal, but hope. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He lay in bed, hands over his chest, whispering prayers he wasn't sure how to end. He wondered if Elijah had once done the same. And while the town slept beneath the soft Georgia stars, two hearts, one remembering, one still searching, beat with the same question, can truth survive beneath stained glass and silence in the distance? The church bell stood still, waiting for the next Sunday. By Wednesday morning, the sanctuary no longer felt like a place of peace. The whispers began, soft and subtle, like a draft under a locked door. Congregants spoke in the fellowship hall, not with certainty, but with suspicion. Someone had seen Elijah walking toward the study with a stranger. Another said the man had sat in the third pew, alone, watching Elijah the entire sermon. A few nodded knowingly, as if secrets could be confirmed by a glance and sealed by silence. Martha Caldwell noticed the shift. She had built her life around order Sunday routines, clean appearances, and men who stayed in line. For her, the church was not just a house of worship, it was a house of control, and Elijah Hayes, in her eyes, was its most prized resident. She had spent years shaping his public image, ensuring no trace of impropriety ever reached the altar. He was obedient, articulate, and gracious. But now something felt off. Elijah looked tired, distracted. His sermons, though still composed, held a tremor in their rhythm. His eyes drifted more often to the back of the room. His hands clutched the pulpit a moment longer. Martha began to pay closer attention. That same week, Lucas came to Elijah's office, eyes dark with restlessness, voice fragile but urgent. He didn't ask for prayer. He didn't ask for permission. He asked for truth. He stood by the bookshelf, where the old texts gathered dust, and said quietly and almost without breath, I don't think I can stay here. Not if being here means hiding who I am. Elijah didn't respond right away. His heart felt like glass held over flame. He had prepared sermons on compassion, on courage, on God's unwavering love, but none of them had prepared him for this moment. Because it wasn't about theology, it was about example. And Lucas wasn't asking for advice. He was asking for a reason to stay alive. Elijah looked at the young man who reminded him too much of himself at that age, eager to belong. afraid to be known. And for the first time in years, Elijah wanted to tell the truth. But fear still sat in the corner of the room like a sentinel. Lucas's eyes shimmered, but he didn't cry. Instead, he stepped forward, laid something on Elijah's desk, and walked out. It was a rolled-up sketch. The lines were clean, drawn in graphite and ink. It showed a reimagined chapel, modern arches, wide-open glass, natural light flooding the altar. The words, "The Sanctuary of Truth," were written in careful script beneath the drawing. Taped to the back was a note, "If you can't speak it, let the walls do it for you." Micah had left it behind, a silent offering, a vision of what worship could be, not built on silence and shame, but on light and presence. Elijah held the sketch in both hands, unsure if it felt like a gift or a mirror. Meanwhile, outside the study, the rumors grew sharper. "He's changed," someone muttered during choir rehearsal. "He meets alone with that visitor," another added in the kitchen. "Something's not right," Martha whispered to the elders. Each whisper felt like a nail, and Elijah could feel the weight building. The pulpit had never felt higher, the robes never heavier. That night, in the quiet of his house, Elijah sat beneath a small lamp, the blueprint open before him, Micah's handwriting still fresh in his mind. He thought of Lucas, he thought of his younger self, he thought of Micah, of what they had shared and what they had lost in the name of keeping the peace. And then he closed his eyes and prayed, not for strength, but for clarity. Because the truth was no longer something he could outrun. It had found a seat in the third pew. It had spoken in a hallway. It had sketched a sanctuary. And now it was waiting for him to decide to speak or to stay silent once more. The smell of smoke came before the sound of sirens. It was just past midnight when Elijah's phone rang. The voice on the other end was urgent. There had been a fire behind the church. Small, quickly controlled, but intentional. Someone had broken into the storage area near the back wall and set fire to a pile of hymnals. No casualties, just ash and suspicion. By dawn, news had already spread through the congregation like wildfire itself. And at the center of every whispered theory was not the fire, but the man seen near the church earlier that week. A stranger, a man some described as too familiar with their pastor. Micah Brooks. A photo surfaced online, grainy, taken from across the street. It showed Micah walking alone near the chapel steps. His face caught mid-turn, eyes unreadable. Underneath, the caption read, "He doesn't belong here." Within hours, the comments followed slurs, questions, condemnation, and with them came Martha. She convened a meeting of the church elders that same afternoon. The fellowship hall, once filled with children's songs and the clatter of potluck dishes, now echoed with cold resolve. Martha stood at the head of the table, her tone measured, her words chosen carefully. She did not accuse Elijah directly. She didn't have to. She spoke of moral responsibility, of leadership, of public trust. She said the fire was not the only threat to the church. She said the atmosphere had changed, and the congregation felt uneasy. She said rumors had grown too loud to ignore. Then she turned to Elijah. Her voice dropped to something softer but not kinder. "Perhaps," she said, "it is time to consider stepping down for the good of the flock." Elijah did not argue. He sat still, hands folded in front of him, eyes steady. Inside, something had already shifted. The old fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He didn't ask for more time. He didn't ask for understanding. He asked for one thing only: to speak one last time, one final sermon, no announcements, no bulletins, just a Sunday. And the truth. They agreed, mostly out of habit, perhaps out of guilt. And so, the next Sunday, Elijah stood behind the pulpit for what was to be the final time. The sanctuary was full, but silent. Eyes watched him not with reverence, but calculation. Some held hope, others held judgment. A few simply held their breath. Elijah did not open with scripture. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend. He only told the truth. He spoke of a love he once knew, a man who made him feel seen, a man he let go. Not because he didn't love him, but because he feared what that love would cost. He spoke of the years he had spent in hiding, of the sermons that praised honesty while his own heart remained locked away. He spoke of Lucas without naming him, of the young who were watching, waiting, needing someone to step first. And then, in a silence thick enough to feel, he asked one question: if love is sin, then why do I still pray for him every night? No one moved. No one spoke. Even Martha sat motionless, her eyes unable to meet his. Elijah closed his notes, stepped away from the pulpit, and walked down the aisle, not as a preacher, not as a symbol, but as a man. His robes felt lighter, the floor beneath him, steady. Outside, the sky was overcast, but the air smelled clean. And though he had no answers waiting for him beyond the chapel doors, Elijah knew the truth had been spoken, not as a weapon, not as a confession, but as a release. The church doors closed behind Elijah for the last time with the same quiet they had always offered him, gentle, final, and without resistance. There was no applause, no farewell gathering, just a silence that followed him into the morning, settling over the town like dust on an untouched pew. He returned home to find his house exactly as he had left it still. Small and honest, but something felt different, as if the air itself no longer needed to hold its breath. Elijah poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and placed the blueprint Micah had left in front of him. The sanctuary of truth, a vision that still pulsed with life in every careful line and soft curve. He turned it over, looking once more at the note Micah had written. The ink had begun to fade, but the meaning never had. And then he saw something new. Tucked beneath the blueprint was an envelope he hadn't noticed before. His name was written in neat handwriting, not Micah's, but someone else's. Inside was a single page. No decoration, no signature, just a letter, and the truth. I saw him at the airport. I heard him tell the airline that he was flying back from New York Presbyterian Hospital. He wasn't here for his mother. He didn't have one left. I had followed him once, not out of malice, out of fear, out of curiosity. I saw him drawing in the garden after church, holding his phone like he was waiting for time to run out. Then I understood. He wasn't here to start over. He was here to finish something. I think he knew he didn't have much time, and the last thing he wanted was to hear your voice one more time. Not your silence, your voice. I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner. Lucas, Elijah sat back, the letter trembling in his hand. Micah had come back to say goodbye, not in words, not in confession, but in presence. He had sat in that third pew not because he needed answers, but because he already knew them. He had wanted to hear Elijah preach not as a stranger, not as a closeted man, but as someone still worthy of love. Tears came slowly, not from shame, not from grief, but from the weight of something unspoken finally given form. By sunset, Elijah began packing his things, not out of escape, but out of beginning. He left behind the old church, the sermons, the expectations, and months later, in a quiet town just beyond the Blue Ridge, a new door opened. It wasn't called a church. It was called the Third Pew, a spiritual refuge, a place not bound by stained glass or creeds, but by stories and presence, where anyone could walk in not to be fixed, but to be seen. Lucas was the first to sit beside him, not as a follower, not as a burden, but as someone willing to carry truth alongside him. On the far wall, framed in oak and light, hung Micah's blueprint, his final sketch, his final sermon. Elijah stood beneath it every Sunday, not to perform, not to conceal, but to remember. Because love had walked through the chapel doors once, and this time Elijah didn't let it walk away unseen. Do you think love, when hidden for too long, can still weave its way back? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, there's more to discover. Subscribe to Heart Story for stories that speak the truth. even when the world won't.